Now what we're going to do in this first step is I call adhering to the style guide. So we probably all built our AngularJS applications. Maybe we adhere to some sort of personal style guide, or maybe we didn't at all. Or maybe we built it quite a long time ago before we really had a really good idea of what a good style guide for an Angular 1 application was. But now there is an endorsed official Angular 1 style guide by the Angular team, which is available on GitHub with the link here. It's github.com John Papa Angular-style guide. And if you go into the style guide, and then there you can see there's one for Angular 1 and one for the modern Angular. So let's go click onto the Angular 1 style guide. And if you scroll down, you can see there's quite a few recommendations that it has. Now, I wouldn't recommend, well, you can go through and implement as much or as little of this as you want. This is a great chance to basically modernize your Angular application, your AngularJS application, and just really bring it up to some sort of base level standard. Now, it's up to you how much you take from this. The bare minimum, which we need to do in step one, and I just recommend pretty much doing just step one, doing just this for step one, is adhering to the single responsibility rule. And with the single responsibility rule, we basically have one entity or component per file. Okay, so before, whereas in an AngularJS application, we might have multiple things in one file, the recommended approach now is to have one entity per file. Okay. Now the reason it's recommended this way is because, well, when in an Angular application, a modern Angular application, everything is actually all in separate files. So starting off now, breaking everything up into separate files makes the process of migrating eventually to Angular much, much easier. And it also makes the modularization of this whole thing really simple. So that's the only thing I would really recommend that we do in step one. But again, you can go through and implement as many or as little of these as you want. We're only going to be implementing the single responsibility rule. So let's take a look at that. How would we actually do that? And I'm not going to do that for all of our files just because it's pretty much the same pattern for all of them. But let me just do it for the controllers, and then as an exercise, you can then implement it for the controllers, directives, filters, and services. So if you look in our controllers.js file, you can see inside here, we've actually got multiple controllers. There we go, we've got multiple controllers all implemented in one file. I want to break this up so there's 4 separate files, one for each of these controllers. Now I like to stick it in a folder called controllers. Let's just do that. Let's create a folder called controllers. And inside there, let's create the person create controller. Now the naming is quite important. So let's call it person create dot. The dot is important. Control.js. So in future versions of Angular, you'll see, modern Angular, you'll see that there is the name. In filing naming, you'll see the kind of the name of the file, and then dot, and the type of file, then dot, then the type of, whether it's a TypeScript or JavaScript file there. So we're creating controllers, we're going to call it .controller.js. So to actually implement this, all we need to do is, well, let's just copy and paste all of that into here. And then actually, let's just delete everything else. And there we go. Now that controller is in its own file. So let's do the same for the other controllers. Okay, so now you can see I've actually created 4 separate controllers. We got the person create controller, the edit, the list, and the search controller. So just split them up into their own separate files. Now to make sure this still works, let's go into our index.html file, and then at the bottom here, so previously we just loaded our controllers.js file, but now we've got 4 separate controller files. Let's just import those individually. So it was person create controller, person create controller.js, and then it was person list controller, person edit controller, and then it was actually search controller. And then, yep, that's now loaded up. That's now saved, sorry. And to make sure it's working, all we need to do is to go back. Well, actually, let's just double check and make sure everything's still running. So if you open up our terminal again at the bottom here, as you can see now, we've still got those two applications running. The first one is our server. So the server is still running, our API server is still running. And then just double check that our local server is still running on 5000. It is. Let's go back into our application. I'm just going to hit refresh just to make sure, yep, everything still looks good. It still looks like everything's fine. So now, even though we split everything up into separate controllers, we've done it correctly and the application is still functioning. So now I can take the next step, which let's just delete the controller itself, our old controller.js, move that to trash. And now let's just do the same thing for our directives, filters, and services. So I'm going to just go through and break them all up into separate files as well. Okay, so now I've split up the directives, the filters file, and the services file so that they're separate individual JavaScript files. So you can see each directive is now in its own separate file. The same goes for filters and the same goes for all of the services. I've also had to make sure, if you go to index.html, I've also had to make sure that I've changed all the script tags. So we're now pulling in the individual files instead of previously we were just pulling in one services file, one directives, and one filters file. Now again, just double check everything's still running. So again, yep, we've got the two terminals still running, our API server and our web server. Now let's go into the browser. I'm going to hit refresh, and yeah, everything is still working just as before. So that's it. We've completed step one, which I described as adhering to the style guide, but really what I mean is adhering to step one of the style guide, which is ensuring that each individual entity, being a controller or a component or a directive or whatever, is in its own separate JavaScript file, because that makes the process of migration much, much easier. And remember, if you just want to see the finished code and you don't want to follow along by coding along with me, then you can just check out step one from the GitHub repo. Just check out step one and you will get to the point where we're at right now.